Hope you had a good week since we last talked. If you're a constant listener and if this is your first tuning in to the Far Middle podcast, welcome. Glad to have you. Nick DeOlius, host of the Far Middle, episode 44. And before we get to our dedication for this episode number 44, I just do want to mention that my upcoming book, Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America, is due out literally in a matter of days. So if you haven't pre-ordered a copy, please do so. All the net proceeds going to a great cause, the CNX Mentorship Academy, and I think you will enjoy not just the book, but also have the view that the issues and themes raised in it are more timely than ever. I guess I should say unfortunately, and tie unfortunately with that statement. Now, episode 44, in terms of our dedication, easy call for this one. We're going to go with Hammerin Hank, Hank Aaron, the great Hank Aaron, Mobile, Alabama's finest. Of course, he broke Babe Ruth's home run record. He also broke some racial barriers along the way. One of the few players in MLB history that accumulated over 3,000 hits and 500 home runs. That's a rare combo for sure. Was also, by the way, a heck of a fielder. A lot of people don't realize that about Hank Aaron. I think he won 3 Gold Gloves, so a significant set of accomplishments in the field as well as what he was able to do with the bat. And he was also a bridge between eras. Interestingly, Hank Aaron, of all people, he retired as the last active player in the major leagues who played in the Negro Leagues. He was the last one of that era, so when he retired, that was it. Basically, at that time moving forward, all the MLB players, none of them had done any time, experienced any time playing in the Negro Leagues, so he was definitely a bridge, one of the last. And when he was in the Negro Leagues, Hank Aaron was paid per game $3 a game. Think about what he would earn today in the major leagues when you look at some of these contracts. And by the way, the issue of what baseball players particularly used to get compensated with respect to and practicing their craft and what the contracts are today, that has been sort of a point of resentment for many years, probably for decades, between what I would call the old timers and the modern day players. I think the old timers for a long time now have looked at today's contracts and today's money and shake their heads and have a bit of resentment because of what they were paid and what they were compensated for when they were playing during their era. So a lot has changed, and sometimes I think that creates a bit of resentment. And when you think it through, who can blame them? Now, most people know about the death threats that Hammerin Hank got when he was chasing Babe Ruth, but most don't know another side of this type of story or this aspect of his story much earlier in his career. Back earlier in his career, in the late 50s, he became friends with a Catholic priest. And through his friendship, Hank Aaron converted to Catholicism sometime around 58, 59 in the late 1950s. The priest at the time was encouraging him to go to Mass every Sunday, but Hank Aaron had to tell the priest, his friend, that wasn't entirely possible, particularly in Florida during spring training because of segregation. So just think about that for a minute. The ability to go to church being impacted by segregation not all that long ago. Another little interesting tidbit about Hammerin Hank is that MC Hammer, if you grew up or experienced music in the early 90s, everybody knows MC Hammer, whether you liked his music or not. He was everywhere you looked or listened in the early 90s. But MC Hammer is from Oakland, California. He was the bat boy for the Oakland A's when he was a kid, and his facial likeness resembled that of Hank Aaron. So a lot of the A's and a lot of the players on the A's during that era of the 70s when they were winning World Series and championships, they nicknamed him Hammer after Hammerin Hank. So that's how MC Hammer took on his stage name because of his facial resemblance to Hank Aaron and the Oakland A's players at the time, recognizing it and giving him the nickname Hammer. My first baseball card, by the way, I'm a big sort of collector of baseball and football cards, but my first baseball card as a kid was Hank Aaron's last baseball card as a player. It's the 1976 Topps card when he was with the Brewers. I got it, I'll never forget this, bought my first pack of baseball cards in a Kmart lobby vending machine. I was 9 years old, and I still have that baseball card. So Hank Aaron, for me, mythical player, just because two things. I think his timing, when his career was ending and his name recognition, and when I started to become more aware of what was going on in sports as a young kid, and also, of course, because of the man that he was. Episode 44 dedication, easy call this week for sure. Last week, of course, on the Far Middle, we covered Russia, Ukraine, and we paid particular attention to what was going on the international stage with other nations, with Russia, with Ukraine. As promised, this week, we want to do part two of Russia, Ukraine, but this week we want to spend more time focusing in on what's going on with the United States and its leadership, or should I say, lack thereof. And I want to start with a comment that a friend of mine made to me the other day when he said it's very tough watching what's going on in the world today. And that's certainly true, of course. But my response was one where I said, hey, it's tougher in a lot of ways watching what's going on with our country these days. And if you look at what's going on with the United States and this current administration as it pertains to something like Ukraine and dealing with Russia, this goes back, a lot of the problems that we're experiencing goes back to the same issue we've been talking about quite a while on the Far Middle podcast, which is how this administration, the extreme environmental movement, the left, is taking these anti-science climate change policies to far extremes. They're wrapping it with this veneer that's basically a lie of zero carbon, and they're using it to do things like attack and vilify and destroy domestic energy. And when you do that, the consequences, and these consequences should be foreseeable, we should not be surprised by them, but yet sometimes some of us look at what's going on today and we are shocked. But the consequences of trying to destroy or erode domestic energy, because energy affects everything, is going to be things like inflation that's raging. It's going to be things like capital markets volatility, so all this volatility and pain that you're seeing now in the stock market. It's going to be things like, economic growth concerns, and maybe most importantly, it is going to have implications where it weakens us globally. Our geopolitical positioning is absolutely going to be weakened, and what you're seeing is that playing out before our very eyes when you're looking at a situation like Russia and the Ukraine. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that the worst is yet to come. If things don't change when it comes to these issues surrounding the pushing, the shoving down our throats of these extreme climate change policies that are really aiming at something entirely different than what they're warranting to solve for or what they're warranting to cure, the worst is yet to come. Our leadership down there in D.C. has been hugely disappointing through this whole crisis in the Ukraine, which is following on a bunch of disappointments over the past year plus. It seems that this administration, my first thought is that it is very much obsessed. It focuses initially whenever a crisis hits on evacuations. That's the first thing that comes to mind for the administration. In the Ukraine, same thing happened. We evacuated our embassy way too soon. That showed little courage. It showed no confidence in the Ukrainian sort of power-based leadership, which wasn't good. The Russians picked up on that and saw that. I believe it emboldened them. We offer, of course, the Ukrainian president to evacuate him as soon as the invasion starts. His response, of course, was a classic. I don't need a ride. I need ammo. And we really don't do anything. We hesitate greatly to do anything tangibly to stop the Russian advance. You had Afghanistan with that whole botched evacuation and the loss of life that was tied to it. And now we followed up with Ukraine, certainly very concerning, not our finest moments by any stretch. And then our president, he is doing everything he can to determine Ukraine's fate early and not in a good way from the perspective of the Ukraine. And how is he doing that? Well, it's a range of different things that he said or that he's acted upon. First, he said that minor incursions, I think that was the term he used, minor incursions would not be responded to. If the Russians made minor incursions into the Ukraine, we wouldn't, or NATO wouldn't respond to that. Of course, he was pressed on that and did some dancing around it. And his handlers did some dancing around it, but that certainly did not set a good tone, very Neville Chamberlain-like in terms of that position. Then he rolled out the phrase, the popular phrase of boots on the ground. So that got rolled out early on in this whole crisis. Then he also followed that up with rolling out the no-fly zones. That wasn't going to happen. There was the issue with the Polish jets. Poland wanted to send jets to the Ukraine, and the word was that NATO did not approve it. But the reason NATO didn't approve it was that the ultimate veto went right to President Biden. He personally, pun intended, I suppose, shot down that concept of sending jets to the Ukraine. So there's been a big focus from President Biden, from the administration on what we won't do, and letting Putin know what we won't do, that certainly is not constructive. And another leader of the current administration, key player, John Kerry, the self-prescribed climate czar, what a complete fool he's been exposed to be through the Ukrainian crisis. He goes on record saying that his worry is not about what's going on with the Russians invading and loss of life and all that that might ensue from it. No, he's worried first and foremost that the invasion of the Ukraine would cause massive emissions. Just shows you where his head is at. He also went on record, I don't know if it was the day of the invasion, but it certainly was within the first couple of days. He went on record he was hoping that the invasion would not deter Putin from climate commitments. What a ridiculous statement, but the guy made it. Thought through it, consciously thought about what he wanted to say, went on record and basically stated that. This was someone who not long ago was our highest ranking diplomat in government. He was someone that ran for president, of course. He's now, as I said, this self-proclaimed climate czar. It's frightening to see with someone who held that power and currently has that power, how he views the world and where his attention is. I think he's proof positive, John Kerry is, of what Lenin was saying about capitalists when he said that capitalists will sell the rope to hang themselves with. John Kerry, in the end, is Putin's most effective weapon. He's not a secret weapon anymore. He's just a very blatant, tangible asset for people like Vladimir Putin and what's going on with the Chinese Communist Party. So John Kerry, diplomat, my you-know-what. Then there was the State of the Union speech. So while our climate czar was out there saying incredibly idiotic things on the world stage, we also had the State of the Union, where President Biden spoke in front of Congress. And just a couple of thoughts here to put out there and share with you. One, I saw we dropped the mask mandate for Congress. So I guess that shows, because COVID and masks are no longer politically fortuitous for the left or for those in power, that some virtue signaling that was once an asset can quickly become a liability. And if it's not paying dividends anymore for you politically, there goes the virtue signaling. Out the door it goes. And that has certainly been the case, it seems, with mask and mask mandates. And then another thought that I had watching the State of the Union, enough already. We talked about, sort of respect and showing some pride and handling yourself professionally, and how that's gone by the wayside in today's society, and certainly with politics today. And you see it again with this State of the Union recently that we just had in early 2022. Enough with the acting up on both sides of the aisle. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, show some professionalism. You're there representing a whole bunch of people that elected you to sit in office. Sort of treat that position with respect. It should be what I would reference as an adult-only zone. You like it. So when people speak up, but then they speak up in a way where it becomes childish, immature, counterproductive, people like it when they agree with what the issue du jour is. So if it's an issue that, so if you don't like President Biden and you see somebody in Congress during State of the Union stand up and start yelling or screaming or wearing messages during the speech trying to be disruptive, and you applaud. Then if the shoe's on the other foot the next week, right, and it's an issue where somebody on the other side of the political spectrum is doing the same thing, well, then they're being, they're being counterproductive and they're being non-professional. I think as a society and as Americans, we need to be much more consistent. You shouldn't be able to flip your view on this the moment the shoe is on the other foot because of what the issue is or how the issue changes. This is one, again, of just professionalism, respecting the office, handling yourself with class and dignity. So I don't care if it's Nancy Pelosi tearing up Trump's speech during his State of the Union address a couple of years ago. Didn't like that. Completely unprofessional. I don't care if it's Republican Congress people, Congresswomen, congressmen, whoever, yelling out and wearing messages on themselves during Biden's speech trying to be disruptive. Both are wrong. Both should be above that. And we need to get back to some modicum of respect when it comes to our leadership and, of course, across society in total. And a lot of what I see coming out of D.C. During this crisis with Ukraine and from this administration, it just smells and smacks of desperation. I think it's a desperate spin. It comes across as desperate spin of the administration and the left, which is the puppet master, at least of this administration, as far as we can tell. The left, the Biden administration, they're stuck. This situation has basically got them cornered. So they can't allow domestic energy to be developed because it goes against their religion and their ideology of this climate change zealotry and this zero carbon fantasy. So they can't do that. So what do? How do you manage the Russians and what's going on with the Ukraine and what might be happening on an even wider scale when it comes to China and things like Taiwan and the South China Sea? Well, you go to the optics, you go to the things that don't make sense on their face. They got you scratching your head, right? So we send our emissaries to Venezuela, of all places, to beg them for oil. So the heck with domestic energy production, let's go to Venezuela. That's a very kind regime, right? We will shamefully appease entities like Iran, trying to get a new quote-unquote nuclear deal done with them, when in reality we know what that's going to be. We're going to basically pay a ransom, a king's ransom, and God knows what type of geopolitical security that will sacrifice to get Iran to start pumping more oil or to get their oil back on the global markets. The sanctions had been pretty much shut down. And what did Iran do in response? When they didn't get what they want and when the Russians interjected themselves into the demands and the Iranians were happy to allow the Russians to intercede, they shut down the talks. And then before you knew it, they launched, 10 or a dozen missiles near a U.S. Army outpost in Iraq. So that's what we got for the appeasement. Another example of how appeasement never pays in the end. Then we've got the president sort of rumoring to be taking a trip to Saudi Arabia, but then we find out he wanted to have a phone call with UAE and Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis did not take the call because the Biden administration has been very hostile towards the Saudis from the get-go, tried to publicly embarrass them with how they handled things early on in the administration when it took power, and now it's time to pay the piper. What goes around comes around. So the Saudis are saying, hey, you didn't help us. You tried to take it to us early on. Why would we be in a position to help you now? Then we do the optics. We go after the quote-unquote the oligarchs, and we seize their yachts. So the United States and the Western nations are seizing these boats all over the world at all these different exotic port of calls. But think about what's going on with these oligarchs, these henchmen, these friends of Putin, and how this is all working out for them. So just think through the math and the sequential logic of what's going on. So we take their yacht, and I guess that hurts because that looks to be an expensive boat. I don't know much about boats, but those things look to be pretty big and pretty luxurious. So we take their boat, and then we make these announcements. Different corporations are making announcements where we're dumping Russian assets. Energy companies, commodity companies, retail companies, everybody's dumping their assets that they've got in Russia through joint ventures and the like. So who benefits when you think through this sequentially? So I think when you think through it, the oligarchs are going to come out ahead. And why are they going to come out ahead? Well, a couple of things, right? First thing is this tension. So our climate change policies coupled with the geopolitical tensions, our inability to deal with Russia and the Ukraine, what's it doing to commodity prices and asset prices for natural gas, for oil, for nickel, for platinum, for diamonds, for every type of an imaginable commodity you can think of, because Russia is such a big producer of those commodities. It's driving up the prices. When you drive up the prices, guess what the oligarchs own their major interests in? Guess how they became oligarchs? It's in those very same commodities. So they're on a balance of payments basis. They're losing the yacht, but they're making God knows how many multiples more than that on the benefit of higher prices for the widgets, effectively, that they're in the business of producing. And then, we take his yacht, we force these climate change policies down everybody's throats. We take the approach of appeasement that helps stoke war and drives war. And again, pricing goes up for commodities. We dump those assets. Guess who picks up those assets dirt cheap? I'm assuming Putin will redistribute those interests that the Western corporations jettisoned and left behind. He will reapportion them to his oligarchs, and they get them dirt cheap. In the end, when you do all the math, the oligarch ends up getting richer than he was before this whole mess began. But yet we're still buying Russian oil until the ban came because it was an embarrassment, right? Once again, the Biden administration the left were cornered with respect to what they had to do there. So they got sort of pushed into an oil ban. And we were still buying Russian nickel, right, until that became an embarrassment. And it just shows the lack of thinking things through, the lack of a coherent policy, and effectively large-scale, widespread incompetence. You also have a major financial entity, Gazprom Bank, who is avoiding sanctions. Why are they avoiding sanctions? Why are they the one bank that doesn't get sanctioned like the other Russian banks? Because they're the ones that basically are the clearinghouse, the trading platform, the balance sheet, so to speak, to allow Russian natural gas to flow to Europe and elsewhere. The Europeans are now dependent on Russian natural gas because of their energy policies, because of climate change policy. Thus, Gazprom Bank has to continue on without sanction. Meanwhile, in our country, you've got the entire whole of government, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Labor with what they're doing with 401ks and retirement plans, the EPA, of course, a whole bunch of different government bureaucratic entities and agencies, not getting into individual state governments, that are aggressively and continually attacking and sanctioning U.S. banks that are have the gall to lend to the domestic natural gas industry or the domestic oil industry. So when we keep referencing in the media that the sanctions by the United States and the Western world are unprecedented, do you really think that they're unprecedented when you think this through and you look at the facts? Maybe they're unprecedented in the light of stupidity, but that's about the only aspect where I see they're unprecedented from. And while this incompetence is being practiced by our administration, you get all these lies that are thrown out there to try to provide cover. You hear things where the administration saying that when it comes to the appeasement of Iran, there's no link between the Iranian concessions and what's going on with Russia or the state of the oil markets. Does anybody really believe that? When we get to look at what the administration's stance is on Venezuela and these talks that are going on with Venezuela, the administration's position with this is much more than just about oil. Does anybody believe that? When people are pressing the administration on inflation, their view is that's due entirely to what's going on with Russia. They blame it basically on Putin. And our energy policies and our climate change policies have nothing to do with it. Our anti-work policies have nothing to do with inflation. In fact, we just need to double down or triple down on those things because of inflation. Does anybody believe that? When they say that the Keystone Pipeline wouldn't have changed anything on oil prices or supply and demand in the United States, does anybody believe that for a minute? And when they say that there's no attack, there's no vilification going on when it comes to domestic energy, whether it's natural gas or oil, does anybody for a minute believe it? Another sort of consequence that we've seen within the United States with Russia and the Ukraine, it has given a massive jolt to the late, slow-moving, asleep at the switch, politically controlled Federal Reserve. We've talked about the Fed extensively on the Far Middle. I think the Russian situation is making the Fed's predicament even more extreme right now. We're soon going to figure out that the Federal Reserve has been abysmally late in moving on more moderate, more reasonable monetary policy. And this situation that we're viewing with Russia and the Ukraine and all of the follow-on consequences, it's only going to expose the Fed to be in worse position than we had imagined. So I'd say watch the stock market closely. I know it's been very volatile of late, big down days, big up days, but net significantly down. But watch it because of not what's going on just with respect to Russia and oil and inflation and all this other stuff. It's going to be easily and quickly blamed on those things, be blamed on Putin. I think that's false reasoning. The Fed has been late to respond by years now when it comes to monetary policy. They've had these emergency measures in place for over a decade. And now you've got things that are external shocks, sort of black swan events, with things like Putin that are always going to be a possibility in the real world. Yeah, I think Putin and Ukraine, the invasion of it, made it worse, but it didn't cause the primary pain or the problems to begin with when it comes to our economy and when it comes to monetary policy and when it comes to the Fed. By the way, another thing that Putin killed and that our climate change policies have ultimately killed was the Fed put. The Fed put with respect to the Fed supporting, providing a floor to the market, always providing nothing but upside and rosy expectations in the future when it comes to stock market valuations. The Fed put, ladies and gentlemen, is dead. RIP Fed put. I brought this up last week, but it's important to emphasize it yet again. The single biggest conclusion of what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, all the consequences of it, is being able to see the difference, to be able to separate the symptoms from the root cause or the root madness. The root cause of all this, the root madness, is not the brutal man in Moscow. He's the Frankenstein of a symptom. He's a symptom that is coming from being caused by the core root problem. And the core madness in all this is the West when it comes to the climate change policies and those who are shoving them down our throats. They created this mess. This mess could be everything from inflation to supply chain issues to lack of energy security, geopolitical weakening, Russian invasion of Ukraine, all of the above. And these climate change policies and those who are pursuing them and pushing them, they enabled madmen like Putin. If you stop the climate change policy insanity, you fix the problems. The symptoms go away. If you allow climate change policies to continue to expand and impact every aspect of society and economy, then there's going to be more pain and suffering, economic pain and suffering, and human pain and suffering. It's just that simple. Now, a couple of you have asked me about the Fauci focus. Where has the Fauci focus gone? You haven't heard anything from me on that in a couple of episodes. And I have to admit, I may have to retire this feature because the self-proclaimed face of science, Dr. Fauci, has disappeared. Now, where did he go? I don't know. You couldn't turn on a TV without seeing him up until about a month ago. And then all of a sudden, I guess COVID was no longer politically fortuitous for the left and for the elite. So now COVID is a political liability, and the state and the media and the establishment and the medical profession have deep-sixed it. No more, mass media coverage on the major news outlets, no more mandates, no more sensational stories about mobile morgues and overwhelmed ICUs in big cities. Heck, like I said earlier, not even any more virtue signaling with things like a mask in public or with Congress. So thus, no more Dr. Fauci. He is now a political liability. I hope you are well, my friend, the good doctor. Well, I'm looking at the clock here. We've already burned through our time allotment for episode 44 of the Far Middle Podcast. I've said it a couple of times in the past. It's amazing how fast the time flies. There are a couple of other things I wanted to get to. I will save those for episode 45. So there's a tease for episode 45. I want to wrap with a happy birthday wish this week to the great George Benson, Pittsburgh native, Shenley High School grad. A lot of people who are familiar with George Benson think of him as solely a singer. So they're thinking of his hit songs like Give Me the Night and On Broadway. Awesome songs for sure. But he is, I think, the greatest jazz guitarist of his generation. His voice is his second best instrument. He is first and foremost a great guitarist. His two best albums, I think, are Breezin' from 1976. Interestingly, the same year from that Hank Aaron baseball card that I told you about at the start of this episode. And Give Me the Night, another awesome album from 1980. A lot of you are familiar with that one. So, Mr. Benson, if you're listening out there in sunny California or wherever you call home, we do miss you back here in cold Pittsburgh. Again, as I mentioned at the start of this, if you haven't already, please order a copy of Precipice, The Last Campaign to Destroy America. It is available on Amazon, in Barnes & Noble, and Indie Books. It's out literally in a couple of days. It would probably ship to you by the time you hear episode 45 of the Far Middle Podcast. And you can follow me on Twitter at Nick Deolius if you've got a few spare moments in your day. Stay safe over the next week. I will talk to you soon with episode 45.